Apartment intruder during city-wide blackout. When the blackout hit, I was curled up on my couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to unwind after a long day. The darkness fell suddenly. Everything in my apartment went pitch black, and my phone signal dropped to nothing. I could hear a hum of confusion outside as neighbors started talking through their doors, some of them using their phone flashlights to peer down the hallway. Living on the 14th floor in a high-rise, I'd grown used to a sense of distance from the world below, almost like an invisible moat around me. The quiet up here was usually a comfort, but tonight, with the entire building plunged into darkness, it felt eerily isolated. About 15 minutes into the blackout, just as I was trying to calm myself, I heard it, a loud, frantic knocking at my door. The sharp, uneven pounding echoed in my apartment, making my skin crawl. My first thought was that maybe it was one of my neighbors, someone panicking in the dark, seeking help. But there was something off about it. No one called out, no names, no voices, just that harsh, demanding knocking that kept going. My heart was pounding as I crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. To my surprise, no one was there. I stood there for a moment, barely breathing, straining to hear anything from the other side of the door. But as quickly as the knocking had started, it stopped, leaving the hallway dead silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, just beyond my line of sight, holding their breath as if waiting for me to open up. It was a strange, primal fear, a feeling I hadn't felt since childhood, like the unsettling presence of something you can't see but know is watching you. After a minute or two, I forced myself to step back and lock the door, though the uneasy silence pressed down on me like a weight. I tried to brush it off and returned to the living room, telling myself it must have just been someone in a hurry to get help, maybe someone who'd already moved on. But just as I started to relax, I heard a faint scraping noise coming from the direction of my balcony. My apartment, being so high up, didn't have easy access from the outside, so I froze, my mind racing. Was it an animal? Maybe a bird caught up in the blackout confusion? But as I listened, the sound grew more deliberate. A slow, steady scratching like something metallic dragging along the glass, moving side to side as if testing the frame of the balcony door. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my ears as I moved toward the balcony, each step quieter than the last. My hands were sweating, and I had to remind myself to breathe, though every breath felt too loud, too obvious. I stayed low, crouching behind the arm of my sofa, and dared to peek out at the glass doors. In the dim light from the city's remaining glow, I could just make out the silhouette of a figure pressed close to the glass, crouched low, their face almost touching the door as they looked inside. I bit down on a gasp, afraid they'd hear even the smallest sound. It was hard to see any features, but I could tell they were tall, their frame large and bulky in a way that looked unnatural, like they were wearing layers of clothing or something else. I couldn't look away, even though I wanted to. I kept thinking, how did they get up here? The doors were still locked, thank God, but all it would take was one wrong move for them to notice me. I felt completely trapped. No phone, no way out except through that door, and this stranger, whoever they were, was just standing there, pressing their hand to the glass like they were waiting for me to come closer. I don't know how long I stayed hidden there, barely daring to blink. Time felt stretched, like I was trapped in some twisted version of reality where every second dragged. I kept hoping they'd just leave, that maybe they'd realize the door was locked and give up. But instead, they pressed their face closer, their breath fogging up the glass as they shifted, trying to see inside. The slow, rhythmic tapping of their fingers against the door was chilling, almost like they were trying to lure me out. Every nerve in my body screamed to stay still, to not even breathe. Eventually, the tapping stopped, but instead of relief, I felt a new wave of dread. The figure slowly stepped back, still watching, and then did something that made my blood run cold. They took a finger and started tracing shapes into the fogged-up glass, a slow, deliberate pattern that was impossible to make out in the dim light. Then, without warning, they turned away, disappearing back over the railing in a way that seemed almost too easy. I stayed frozen, counting each second, barely believing they were really gone. But that terror didn't ease. I felt like they'd left something behind, an unshakable presence lingering in the air, as if they'd left a part of themselves there on the glass. When I finally managed to move, I crawled slowly to the balcony door, careful not to make a sound, and peered out to make sure they were really gone. The streetlights below were out, just shadows stretching in every direction, and my heart sank as I realized there was no one in sight, nothing to prove anyone had been there at all. I tried to process it, but everything felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My hands were trembling as I reached for the door handle to check the lock, making sure it was secure. The last thing I wanted was any chance they could come back. Just then, as if fate was taunting me, the lights flickered back on, casting a cold, pale light through my apartment. I took a shaky breath, thinking it was over, that maybe the power would bring some comfort back. But then I noticed it, just at eye level on the glass door. A message, scrawled in the same foggy residue where the intruder had traced his finger earlier. 3 chilling words stared back at me, clear as day. Next time, leave it unlocked. Seeing those words made my stomach drop. It was one thing to suspect someone had been there, but reading that message felt like they were still here, watching me. I backed away from the balcony door, my mind racing with questions. How had they climbed 14 floors? Why my apartment? The sense of safety I'd always felt in this place was shattered, replaced by an unnerving sense that I'd been specifically targeted. I called building security as soon as I could, struggling to keep my voice steady while I explained what had happened. They checked the cameras, but the blackout had cut the footage, leaving them with only a dark gap and no proof of an intruder. They assured me they'd keep a closer watch, even offered to send someone up to check my apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't matter. Whoever had left that message had been careful, slipping in and out during the blackout like they knew exactly how long they'd have. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every faint sound outside my door made me jump. I kept the lights on and sat in the living room, staring at the balcony door, feeling a mix of fear and anger that this stranger had managed to make me feel so trapped in my own home. In the weeks that followed, I installed extra locks, reinforced my balcony door, and even bought a security system. But I never felt fully at ease again. The memory of that message haunted me, those words, scratched into the glass like a promise that someday, somehow, they'd be back. House sitter targeted by former owners. I took the house-sitting job for the Hamiltons mostly because, honestly, it felt like a dream gig. The pay was excellent, and all I had to do was watch over a luxurious, modern home while they enjoyed a month in Europe. I'd been struggling to make rent, so when my friend offered me this job, she'd done it before and couldn't commit to the stint, I jumped at the chance. The house sat on a hill, a fair drive out of town, with tall windows overlooking the valley and high walls surrounding the property. I loved how secluded it felt, like my own mini vacation. The Hamiltons were a friendly couple, maybe in their late 40s, a bit eccentric with their collection of modern art, but charming enough, and they left detailed instructions for everything. And the house, well, it was breathtaking. Everything seemed perfect. The first few nights were bliss. I'd bring my favorite wine, curl up in their huge living room, and binge-watch movies on the giant flat screen, feeling like I'd hit some kind of jackpot. But on the 4th night, something felt off. It was subtle at first, a strange creak from the back patio, just outside the massive glass doors. I brushed it off as the house settling or maybe an animal. But as I moved to the kitchen, another sound cut through the silence. This time, it was the distinct rattle of the patio door handle, like someone was trying to open it. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I knew I'd locked it earlier. Slowly, I flicked the kitchen light off, hoping that whoever was out there wouldn't see me through the glass. The quiet that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was like the air itself had stopped moving. I stood there in the darkness, barely breathing, straining to hear any other sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, I finally forced myself to peek through the edge of the kitchen curtains. And there they were, two figures, a man and a woman, standing on the back patio, close enough that I could see the anger in their faces even in the dim light. They looked furious, like they'd come with a purpose. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and a thick jaw, the kind of face that looks perpetually clenched. The woman beside him had sharp features, and her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to accentuate the hard look in her eyes. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they stood there, like they weren't just trespassing, they were staking a claim. I crouched down, heart pounding, as they moved away from the patio door and disappeared around the side of the house. I didn't have my phone with me. I'd left it charging upstairs, and now I cursed myself for being so careless. My only option was to hide and hope they'd give up. I scrambled to the closest door that led to a small storage room, barely big enough to fit a person. As I closed myself in, I tried to control my breathing, but the walls felt like they were closing in. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears, and faintly, the creak of floorboards as they entered the house. From my cramped hiding spot, I could hear them moving through the rooms, their footsteps slow and deliberate, like they were savoring every step. A voice, a low, angry whisper, floated through the hall. This was supposed to be ours. All of it. The woman's tone was laced with resentment, each word sharp as a knife. The man mumbled something in response, his voice thick with frustration. I realized then who they must be. The former owners, the ones who'd lost the house in a messy divorce. The Hamiltons had mentioned it briefly, only hinting at the tension, but now I could feel the weight of that bitterness pressing in from every direction. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't check the storage room. My mind raced, trying to think of what I'd do if they found me. There was nowhere to run, no windows, just solid walls and a single door. I could hear them rifling through drawers and shuffling papers, as if looking for something specific. Then, in a chilling moment, the woman's voice came closer, right outside the door. "Someone's been here. This isn't how we left it." I felt a wave of nausea hit me. They knew. They knew someone was in the house, and they weren't about to leave until they'd found whoever it was. I could barely keep my hands from shaking as I waited, straining to listen. The silence stretched out, and then, without warning, I heard the man's voice again, this time with an eerie calmness. "Whoever's here can't stay hidden forever. They'll come out eventually." My stomach twisted as they moved down the hall, past the storage room. I knew they were playing some twisted game, trying to flush me out. I thought about making a run for it, but every step they took seemed to echo through the house, closing off every possible escape route. Then, as abruptly as they'd come, the noise stopped. It was quiet again, but in the most unsettling way, like they were still here, waiting, listening, somewhere in the shadows. After what felt like ages, I finally mustered the courage to peek out. The hallway was empty, and there was no sign of them anywhere. Just as I began to hope they'd left, my eyes landed on something chilling. There, pinned to the wall, was a note written in thick, scrawling letters. "This isn't over. We'll be back." The words felt like a threat, hanging heavy in the air. I couldn't tell if they were truly gone or if they were just outside, waiting for me to let my guard down. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and felt the walls close in around me. My first instinct was to grab my phone from upstairs and call the police, but I knew I'd have to cross half the house to get there. With every step, I felt exposed, imagining them watching from the dark corners, just waiting for the right moment to jump out. I darted up the stairs, forcing myself to stay quiet. When I reached the bedroom, my phone was there on the charger, but, of course, the power outage had left me with no reception. Desperation crept in as I scanned the room, trying to find something, anything, that could make me feel less defenseless. My eyes landed on an old brass letter opener on the Hamiltons' desk. It wasn't much, but it was something. Clutching it tightly, I backed into the corner and tried to think. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every shadow stretched and twisted. And then I noticed it, another note, propped up on the dresser as if left just for me. Don't get too comfortable. We know this house better than you ever will. My blood ran cold as I read the words. They hadn't just come to scare me, they were toying with me, and it felt like they were still close, watching my every move. I sat there, clutching the letter opener, my mind racing through every possible option. My only chance, I realized, was to wait them out until morning, when daylight might finally drive them away. I found myself staring at the window, hoping to catch a hint of first light on the horizon, but the hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Every noise, every faint creak in the house, kept me on edge, my nerves fraying with every passing second. I felt trapped in this place that had felt so luxurious and safe just a few days before. Now, it felt like a cage, each dark corner hiding a threat. Somehow, I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion because the next thing I knew, a thin sliver of morning light was creeping in through the window. I felt a small rush of relief, the kind that only daylight can bring, and slowly stood, every muscle sore from being tensed all night. The house was eerily silent. With the sun up, I decided to do one last check to make sure they'd gone. My footsteps echoed through the halls, each room seeming empty and undisturbed, until I reached the front door. Pinned to it was a final note, one that sent a chill right to my core. "We'll see you soon." The note was the final push. I couldn't stay here another second. I grabbed my things in a hurry, heart pounding as I rushed out the door, still half expecting to see them lurking in the shadows outside. When I finally reached my car and sped away, it felt like I'd escaped some kind of waking nightmare. Even the quiet streets felt surreal, like I'd crossed into another world, leaving that strange, haunted place behind. I drove straight to my friend's apartment in town, barely able to explain what happened as I pieced together the events in a daze. She listened, horrified, but admitted that she'd never heard of any problems during her stays. A few days later, the Hamiltons returned. I debated telling them, but some part of me felt they'd brush it off as paranoia or assume I'd imagined it. Instead, I left the notes with a quick message, telling them I couldn't house sit for them again. But every now and then, I catch myself wondering if they ever noticed the small things those two must have done to the house in their twisted game. I can only hope the Hamiltons understood the warning I left, because something tells me those people weren't finished. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the night, convinced I can hear footsteps or see a shadow outside my window. Motel intruder during tornado warning. I was driving cross-country that week, one of those long stretches on the road with just me, a few gas stations, and an endless playlist of classic rock keeping me company. I was on my way from Missouri to Colorado, and I remember thinking it was strange how empty the highways were. You'd think more people would be out there, but the roads were practically deserted. As the sky started to turn that familiar, stormy green, my weather app blared with a tornado watch. Figuring I'd better wait out the storm, I pulled into the first place I saw, a tiny, run-down motel just off the highway. The kind of place that usually has a couple of rusty pickup trucks outside and a neon sign buzzing on its last leg. The parking lot was nearly empty, just one other car, and there was a quiet that settled over the place, like the calm before a storm. The motel clerk was an older guy with watery eyes and a cigarette hanging from his lip, who barely looked up from his crossword puzzle as he slid me the key to room 7. When I asked if there was a storm shelter, he just shrugged and mumbled something about the bathroom being the best bet. I didn't think much of it then. I was just grateful to be off the road. My room was as bare bones as it gets. One bed, a nightstand with a dead lamp, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a decade. But as I set down my bag, my phone blared again, this time with a full-blown tornado warning. Right on cue, the lights flickered twice before going out completely, plunging the room into a thick, almost suffocating darkness. As I stood there in the dark, trying to get my bearings, I heard a noise that didn't belong to the storm, a slow, creaking sound coming from the hallway outside. It was faint, barely audible over the wind starting to rattle the motel walls, but distinct enough to make me freeze. It sounded like a door opening. I stayed still, listening, feeling the hair on my arms stand on end. Through the thin walls, I could hear the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps, moving slowly from room to room, pausing just outside each one. Whoever it was, they were taking their time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching. For a second, I thought it might be the old clerk making his rounds, but there was something unsettling about the slowness of those steps, like they weren't in any rush to find whatever, or whoever, they were looking for. I stepped closer to my own door, pressing my ear to the cold wood, just in time to hear the door to the room next to mine creak open. A moment later, the steps moved again, this time closer, so close that I instinctively stepped back. My heart was pounding now, each thud echoing in my chest as I realized I wasn't alone in this motel, and whoever was out there was methodically checking each room. Moving quickly, I crept over to the bathroom, feeling my way in the dark, and closed myself in as quietly as I could. I stood there, barely breathing, one hand on the lock, feeling my pulse hammering under my fingertips. I heard the knob on my room door jiggle slightly, a soft click-click as the handle was tested. Then, after a tense pause, the footsteps continued down the hall. I stayed in the bathroom, my ear pressed to the door, listening as the footsteps grew fainter. Each one felt like a countdown, echoing down the empty hall. The wind outside had turned into a low roar, and the whole building seemed to shake as the storm intensified. In that cramped, dark bathroom, every sense felt heightened, and I became acutely aware of every little sound. My mind was racing, wondering who would be wandering a dark motel during a tornado warning, and why they seemed so focused on each room. I tried convincing myself that maybe it was just someone else looking for a safe spot, or maybe the clerk checking on guests. But deep down, it felt off. Whoever it was, they had an intention that I couldn't ignore, a purpose in their slow, methodical steps. Eventually, the footsteps faded completely, but I stayed in the bathroom, too rattled to move. Minutes passed, maybe even half an hour, though time felt slippery in the dark. Then, just as I thought I could hear the storm winding down outside, I heard something, a faint scratching sound, like nails against wood. It was so soft I thought I was imagining it at first, but it slowly grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right outside my door. I held my breath, the realization dawning on me that whoever had been in the hall hadn't left. They'd been waiting. There was no doubt in my mind now. They were trying to get into my room, and I was their last stop. I felt trapped, cornered in that dingy bathroom with nothing but thin walls between me and whoever was outside. My phone was dead by this point, its last few percent drained while I stared at it earlier, desperate for a connection. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like they were drawing it out on purpose. Each scrape sent a chill down my spine, and I had to fight the urge to burst out and run. But where would I go? Outside into the storm? Back into that empty hallway? Every option felt like a dead end. As I stood there, my mind raced with questions. Had they seen me check in? Did they know I was alone in here? And why my room? All I knew was that whoever was out there wanted to get in, and it wasn't for anything good. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the scratching suddenly stopped. I leaned closer, listening intently, almost hoping to hear anything that would signal they'd moved on. But there was only silence. My heart was still hammering when I heard a soft, chilling whisper, barely audible through the thin wall. "I know you're in there," it said, so low that I almost thought it was my mind playing tricks. My entire body tensed up, and I clapped a hand over my mouth, trying not to make a single sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were enjoying this, drawing out each moment just to keep me on edge. Whoever this was, they knew I was in there, and they wanted me to know they knew. I stayed frozen, my hand shaking as I kept it pressed to my mouth, trying to stop the shallow, panicked breaths that were slipping through. every second stretched out, heavy with the anticipation that they might try the door again. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel their presence on the other side, that strange sense of someone watching you, like an electric charge in the air. My thoughts were racing, caught between wanting to escape and knowing that any movement might give me away. For a moment, I let myself hope they'd leave. Maybe the storm would scare them off. Maybe they'd get bored and move on. But the silence was so thick, so unnatural, that I knew they were still there, waiting for something, for some kind of sign from me. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps slowly retreat down the hall, the sound growing fainter with each step. I stayed crouched in the bathroom, afraid that any noise from me might somehow call them back. Finally, I worked up the nerve to crack the bathroom door just enough to peer out. The room was still pitch dark, but I could make out the faint glow of dawn starting to creep in through the window. The storm seemed to have passed, leaving behind an eerie calm that only made the night's events feel more unreal. Gathering what little courage I had, I tiptoed to the door, holding my breath as I turned the lock and pulled it open just enough to peer down the hallway. It was empty, but the feeling that I was being watched was still there, like a heavy shadow following me. With the hallway empty, I decided to grab my things and get out of there as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my few belongings into my bag, throwing nervous glances at the door every few seconds. I kept half expecting the knob to jiggle again, or worse, to see a shadow slip past the crack under the door. When I finally felt ready to leave, I opened the door and stepped into the hall, the air thick with that damp, metallic smell that follows a heavy storm. Everything was dead quiet. No sign of the clerk, no other guests, nothing to suggest anyone else had been there. I hurried down the hallway, my footsteps echoing, feeling exposed and vulnerable in the dim light. As I reached the front desk, I found it empty. The clerk's crossword book was open, the pen lying across it like he'd just left mid-sentence. There was an uneasy feeling about the place, a heaviness that clung to the air. I didn't even bother to drop off the key. I just wanted to get outside, into the fresh air, away from whatever had been lurking in the darkness of that motel. I pushed through the front door and practically jogged to my car, only glancing back once. And when I did, I caught a glimpse of a shadow at the window of my room, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out a face, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unsettling, as if they'd been expecting me to look back one last time. I jumped into my car and peeled out of the lot, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The whole way down the empty road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, like something from that motel was still with me. Even as the storm clouds cleared and the morning sun started breaking through, that sense of dread lingered, making every shadow seem darker. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some creep looking to scare me, or even a prank, but deep down, it didn't feel that simple. The way they'd moved through the rooms, the whisper at my door, the figure in my window. It all felt like something more personal, like they knew who I was, where I was going, and somehow what I was afraid of. When I finally made it to the next town, I pulled into a busy diner just to feel safe around other people. I must have looked like hell because the waitress didn't even ask if I was all right. She just poured me coffee and gave me a sympathetic smile. I stayed there for hours, watching the road, half expecting to see that shadowed figure walk in through the door. Days have passed since that night, but it still sticks with me, like something unfinished, a question with no answer. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened or why they chose me. But one thing I do know, no matter how far I travel, I won't ever stop looking over my shoulder, wondering if one day, I'll see that shadow waiting, watching, knowing exactly who I am. Cabin in the woods with uninvited guests. I rented the cabin with one simple goal: escape. It was early October, and I was burned out, fed up with city noise and endless emails that made my chest feel tight even after logging off. A friend of mine, who knew I was spiraling, suggested this place, a small cabin in a quiet stretch of woods about 3 hours from the city. She swore it was the perfect spot to recharge. So, I booked it impulsively and drove up on a Friday evening, hoping the trees and solitude would work some kind of magic. The cabin was small but charming, nestled among towering pines and far from any main roads or towns. When I first arrived, the air felt dense and still, like the place had been waiting in silence for a long time. I brushed it off as just nerves and decided to lean into the isolation. That night, a storm rolled in, and with it, a heavy darkness swallowed up the cabin. The power went out around 9:30, right when I was settling in with a book and a glass of wine. The outage was sudden, a quick flicker followed by complete blackness. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional roll of thunder. I tried my phone, but of course, there was no signal this far out. Even the weather app wouldn't load. Fumbling through the drawers in the kitchen, I found a box of candles and was about to light them when I heard something that made my stomach twist. A low, whispering sound from outside, like voices drifting through the rain. I froze, listening, unsure if it was the wind playing tricks on me or something else entirely. I held my breath, straining to catch more of those whispers, but they faded into the sound of rain. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, every sense on high alert. Just as I started convincing myself it was nothing, a crunching sound came from the side of the cabin, like footsteps on the wet gravel path that wrapped around the back. My hands shook as I quickly blew out the match, plunging the room back into darkness. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept toward the window by the front door, keeping myself low, hoping to see without being seen. Peering out, my breath caught. 3 figures stood just beyond the tree lean, their clothes drenched, their faces shadowed under the brims of dripping hats. They weren't moving, just standing there, heads slightly tilted toward the cabin as if watching or listening. I ducked down, praying they hadn't seen me. My mind raced. Who were they? Why were they here, in the middle of nowhere, in a storm like this? Part of me wanted to open the door and yell at them to leave, but something about the way they stood, so eerily still, made my skin crawl. I couldn't see their faces clearly, just vague outlines under the rain-soaked hats and coats, but the sight filled me with a cold dread I couldn't shake. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, and finally, I risked another glance out the window. The spot where they'd been standing was empty, no sign of the strangers. But as I scanned the tree lean, I spotted faint marks in the mud near the cabin, like footprints leading right up to the back door. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I backed away from the door, trying to stay as silent as possible. My eyes were slowly adjusting to the darkness inside, but outside, the storm made it impossible to see more than a few feet past the windows. I debated locking myself in the bedroom, but the thought of being trapped in a small room with no other exit terrified me even more. Instead, I sat crouched in the shadow of the kitchen counter, clutching a heavy cast iron pan I'd found hanging on the wall. Every nerve in my body was on edge, attuned to every creak and groan the cabin made. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my mind kept circling back to one haunting question. Why were they here? They weren't hikers caught in the storm. No one wandered that far into the woods without a reason. Just as I started to convince myself they'd left for good, I heard another noise. This time, a soft tapping, like fingers brushing against the wood near the back door. I felt my blood run cold. The taps came in slow, deliberate intervals, and I pictured one of those strangers standing right outside, testing the walls, searching for a way in. The sound stopped suddenly, and I found myself holding my breath again, terrified of giving myself away. Minutes dragged by in silence, and finally, I forced myself to look. I crept over to the window, just enough to catch a glimpse of the back door. My heart nearly stopped. Faint symbols, strange jagged shapes, had been scratched into the wood around the frame. Whoever those people were, they hadn't just been standing around, they'd been marking the cabin. I stared at those strange symbols, feeling a mix of fear and anger rising inside me. The shapes looked almost like runes or symbols I'd seen in old folklore books. Nothing I recognized, but eerie enough to make my skin prickle. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but the intensity in those marks said otherwise. They'd been carved deep into the wood, sharp and deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant as a warning or a claim. My hands were trembling as I stepped back, the weight of my own helplessness pressing down on me. With no phone signal and no neighbors anywhere close, I felt isolated in a way I'd never experienced before, as if I were drifting alone in open water with no land in sight. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound, convinced that at any moment I'd hear those footsteps again. But the whispers, the scratching, everything went silent as the storm finally started to let up. By dawn, I'd worked up enough nerve to check outside, hoping the daylight would make everything feel less sinister. The morning air was damp and heavy, and the ground was littered with broken branches and pools of rainwater. I stepped out cautiously, glancing around the clearing, and my heart sank. My car, which I'd parked just a few steps from the cabin, had been tampered with. The tires were slashed, and more of those strange symbols had been scratched into the doors and hood. Whoever they were, they had wanted to make sure I couldn't leave. Panic gripped me as I took in the damage. I felt like prey caught in a trap, with no way to escape and no one coming to help. I checked my phone again, praying for a bar of service, but the screen mocked me with a red no signal. Desperation took over, and I ran back to the cabin, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon or a way out. My mind was racing, but I tried to think clearly, reminding myself that if I just stayed calm, I might find a way to get to the main road on foot. I found an old flashlight in the kitchen drawer and shoved it in my jacket pocket, just in case, along with a small utility knife I found under the sink. I had no idea how far it would be, but the thought of waiting inside that cabin alone seemed worse than anything out in the woods. I had just opened the door to leave when I froze. There, standing on the edge of the clearing, was one of them, the strangers from the night before. This time, I could see his face more clearly. His eyes were dark, sunken, and his skin looked grayish, almost lifeless, like someone who hadn't seen sunlight in years. He didn't say a word, didn't move. He just watched me, a slight, twisted smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For a second, we stood there locked in this silent stare, and then he slowly lifted his hand, pointing back toward the cabin. It was as if he were telling me to go back inside, that he was in control here. My legs went numb, but I somehow managed to slam the door and lock it, retreating as far from the windows as I could. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it would give me away. I was trapped, with nowhere to run, no one to call. My mind raced through every possible option, but I kept coming back to the same reality. I was alone, and they were outside, waiting. I could hear footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin just as they had the night before. This time, though, it was like they knew I was inside, like they were toying with me. I shut my eyes, trying to control my breathing, wishing I could disappear into the wood itself. Just then, there was a loud bang against the door, followed by a strange scraping sound, as if someone were carving those symbols into the wood again, marking their territory even more aggressively. I lost track of time, sitting there paralyzed as the noises continued. Finally, as the day crept toward evening, everything went silent. I forced myself to stand up, muscles stiff from fear and tension, and I peered cautiously through a crack in the window. The clearing was empty again. The strangers were gone. Swallowing down a mix of exhaustion and dread, I opened the door and stepped outside, half expecting to see them reappear. But instead, I found more symbols carved all around the cabin, on the walls, the windows, even the ground. They were everywhere, surrounding the place like a ring of warning. It was clear now, they had been much closer than I'd thought, leaving marks while I was hiding inside, letting me know they could come back anytime they wanted. I spent the next few hours in a daze, trying to make sense of what had happened, feeling a mixture of terror and defeat. I knew I couldn't stay another night, but with my car disabled and the sun already dipping low, I had no choice but to face one more evening in that place. I barricaded the doors as best I could, dragging heavy furniture against them, and kept the utility knife close. Every creak of the cabin sent my nerves spiraling, and the symbols, those jagged marks staring back at me, seemed to pulse in the fading light, as if mocking me. I felt like I was losing my mind, questioning everything, unsure if they were really gone or just waiting for nightfall to return. As darkness settled over the woods, I huddled in a corner, keeping my eyes fixed on the door, unable to sleep. When dawn finally came, I felt the first hint of relief as sunlight filled the cabin. I stumbled outside, exhausted but determined, and started down the narrow trail toward the main road, leaving the cabin and its marks behind me. Hours later, when I finally reached a spot with cell service, I called for help. A tow truck came for my car, but I couldn't bring myself to explain the symbols or the strangers. It felt too surreal to even put into words. Weeks have passed, and sometimes, I still wake up hearing those whispers or picturing those dark, unblinking eyes watching from the edge of the woods. I haven't gone back to the cabin, and I doubt I ever will. But the worst part is, I know they're still out there, waiting in silence, watching anyone who dares to disturb their woods again.